In a quiet suburb just outside Portland, Oregon, something went terribly wrong in the autumn of 1998, and for nearly 2 decades, almost no one talked about it. A woman vanished from her own life, her name slowly erased from family conversations, her photographs quietly removed from living room walls, and her existence reduced to uncomfortable silence at holiday gatherings. But in 2016, a single forgotten document surfaced during an estate sale, a piece of paper that had been carefully filed away, deliberately overlooked, and intentionally ignored by the very people who should have been screaming her name from every rooftop. What that document revealed would shatter the carefully constructed wall of silence and force an entire family to confront a truth so disturbing, so unthinkable, that they had chosen collective amnesia over facing reality. This is the story of Margaret Chen, the aunt who disappeared, and the family that let her vanish. Margaret Chen was born in 1952 in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents who had arrived in America with nothing but determination and hope for their children's futures. She was the middle child of 5 siblings, sandwiched between 2 older brothers and 2 younger sisters, and family members who knew her in those early years described her as bright, curious, and fiercely independent in ways that sometimes clashed with her traditional parents' expectations. Margaret excelled in school, earned a scholarship to the University of California, Berkeley, and graduated with a degree in library science in 1974, a time when women, especially Asian American women, still faced considerable barriers in professional fields. She worked for the San Francisco Public Library System for nearly 15 years, living a modest but fulfilling life in a small apartment in the Sunset District, never marrying, never having children, but maintaining close relationships with her siblings and their growing families. To her nieces and nephews, Aunt Margaret was the cool relative who brought thoughtful gifts, remembered everyone's birthdays, and asked questions about their lives that showed she genuinely listened and cared. But something shifted in Margaret's life in the late 1980s, something subtle at first, barely noticeable to those who didn't see her every day. Her younger sister, Linda Chen Morrison, later recalled that Margaret seemed distracted during family gatherings, sometimes staring into space mid-conversation, occasionally repeating herself, or forgetting details she would have normally remembered without effort. At first, the family attributed these moments to stress or fatigue, the natural result of a demanding job and the pressures of living alone in an expensive city. Margaret herself brushed off any concerns, insisting she was fine, just tired, just overwhelmed with a particularly challenging project at work. But by 1991, the signs were impossible to ignore. Margaret had been asked to take an extended leave from her position at the library after a series of incidents where she'd misfiled important documents, become confused about her schedule, and on one alarming occasion, couldn't remember how to operate the library's computer system she'd been using for years. The family finally convinced her to see a doctor, and after months of tests, evaluations, and consultations with specialists, Margaret Chen received a diagnosis that would change everything. Early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Margaret was only 39 years old. In the early 1990s, Alzheimer's was still poorly understood by the general public, often associated only with elderly patients in nursing homes. And the idea that someone in their 30s could develop this devastating neurological condition was almost unthinkable to Margaret's family. The diagnosis came with grim predictions: progressive memory loss, cognitive decline, eventual inability to care for herself, and no cure. No treatment that could reverse, or even significantly, slow the disease's relentless advance. Margaret's oldest brother, David Chen, who had always been the family's unofficial leader and decision-maker, took charge of the situation, organizing family meetings to discuss Margaret's care, her finances, and what would happen as her condition worsened. At first, the siblings were united in their commitment to support Margaret, to ensure she received the best possible care, to keep her safe and comfortable for whatever time she had left. But beneath that surface unity, tensions were already forming, disagreements about money, about responsibility, about what caring for Margaret would actually mean in practical day-to-day terms. For the first few years after her diagnosis, Margaret continued living independently with support from home health aides and regular visits from family members who checked on her, helped with bills and shopping, and tried to maintain some sense of normalcy in her rapidly changing life. She had been smart enough, organized enough, to have purchased long-term care insurance years earlier, a decision that now seemed almost prophetic, and she had some savings set aside, though nowhere near enough to cover the astronomical costs of full-time memory care that she would eventually need. David Chen, who worked as a commercial real estate broker and was the most financially successful of the siblings, repeatedly assured everyone that they would figure out the money, that Margaret would be taken care of, that family comes first no matter what. But as Margaret's condition deteriorated faster than anyone had anticipated, as the costs mounted, and the demands on family members' time and energy became increasingly overwhelming, that initial unity began to crack. By 1997, Margaret could no longer live alone. Her insurance was running out. Her savings were nearly depleted. And the family faced a decision that would expose the fault lines running beneath their seemingly solid foundation. The argument started in earnest during a family meeting in August 1997, held at David's large home in the Portland suburbs, where he had moved years earlier for business opportunities and a lower cost of living than the Bay Area. The question on the table was straightforward but loaded with implications. Who would take Margaret in, provide her with a home, and become her primary caregiver as her disease progressed to its inevitable conclusion? David and his wife had a large house with a spare bedroom, but they also had 3 teenage children, demanding careers, and a lifestyle they had worked hard to build and weren't eager to sacrifice. Margaret's 2 other brothers, Thomas and Robert, both cited their own challenges: small homes, financial pressures, young children, wives who had concerns about the burden and the effect on their own families. Her younger sister Linda, who had been closest to Margaret growing up, was going through a difficult divorce and barely keeping her own life together, in no position to take on such an enormous responsibility. Everyone had reasons, explanations, justifications for why they couldn't be the one to take Margaret in, and as the meeting stretched from hours into an entire painful evening, the unspoken truth became impossible to ignore. No one actually wanted to do this. That's when David Chen proposed what he called a practical solution. Margaret's remaining money, combined with contributions from each sibling, would be enough to place her in a memory care facility, not one of the expensive, high-end places they'd toured in San Francisco or Portland, but a more affordable option David had researched in a rural area about 90 miles outside Portland. The facility, called Riverside Care Center, was small, family-run, and while it didn't have the amenities or prestige of larger institutions, it was licensed, inspected, and according to David's research, perfectly adequate for Margaret's needs. The costs would be manageable if split among the 5 siblings. Nobody would have to upend their lives or strain their marriages. And Margaret would receive professional care from people trained to handle Alzheimer's patients. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable compromise, a solution that balanced everyone's limitations and constraints. But there was something else in David's proposal, something that wasn't explicitly stated, but that everyone in that room understood. Placing Margaret in a distant facility would also create distance, physical and emotional space between the family and the difficult reality of her decline. And no one objected. Margaret Chen was moved to Riverside Care Center in October 1997, and for the first few months, family members made regular visits, driving the 90 miles from Portland to spend afternoons with her, bringing treats and photos, trying to maintain connection even as Margaret's ability to recognize them became increasingly sporadic. But as autumn turned to winter and then to spring, the visits became less frequent, the drive suddenly feeling longer, the experience more emotionally draining. The sight of Margaret's decline more painful than anyone wanted to endure repeatedly. David, who had positioned himself as Margaret's primary point of contact with the facility, assured everyone that she was doing fine, that the staff were attentive, that there was no need for everyone to make the trip constantly. He would check in regularly, he promised. He would make sure everything was handled, everyone else could focus on their own families and visit when they were able. And slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the family's connection to Margaret began to dissolve. Her name mentioned less frequently, questions about her met with vague assurances. Her existence fading from daily consciousness like a photograph, left too long in sunlight. Then came September 1998, and Margaret Chen disappeared. Not from her own memory, which was already largely gone, but from the world, from records, from the family's awareness and concern. David received a phone call from Riverside Care Center on September 14, 1998. A call he later claimed informed him that Margaret had been transferred to another facility due to her advancing needs and Riverside's inability to provide the level of care she now required. According to David's account, which he shared with his siblings in a brief, matter-of-fact phone call, Margaret had been moved to a specialized Alzheimer's unit at a facility whose name he couldn't quite remember, somewhere even more remote. And the transfer had happened quickly due to an urgent medical situation. The costs would be higher, David explained, which would require increased contributions from everyone, but it was necessary, it was what Margaret needed. And he would get everyone the details once he had them organized. His siblings, caught up in their own lives and relieved to have David handling the complex and depressing logistics, accepted this explanation without question, without demanding specifics, without insisting on visiting Margaret in her new location. And that was the moment when Margaret Chen truly vanished. The truth was that there had been no transfer, no new facility, no urgent medical situation requiring Margaret's relocation. What had actually happened on September 14, 1998, would not be discovered for nearly 18 years, buried under layers of paperwork, family silence, and one man's desperate attempt to solve a problem that had no good solution. David Chen had indeed received a phone call from Riverside Care Center that day, but the content of that call was very different from what he told his family. Margaret's money had run out, the facility's administrator had explained, and David's promised monthly payments to cover the difference had not materialized for the past 3 months, leaving a balance of over $12,000 owed. Riverside was a small operation running on tight margins, and they could no longer provide care for a patient whose family was not meeting their financial obligations. They gave David 30 days to either pay the outstanding balance and commit to regular payments going forward, or make arrangements to move Margaret elsewhere. David Chen, whose successful business facade hid serious financial problems including debts, failed investments, and an unsustainable lifestyle, had no idea how to come up with $12,000, let alone commit to monthly payments he couldn't afford. What David did next would haunt him for the rest of his life, though at the time he convinced himself it was a temporary measure. A stopgap until he could get his finances sorted out and figure out a real solution. He made a series of phone calls to other care facilities, looking for somewhere cheaper, somewhere that would accept Margaret with minimal upfront costs, somewhere that would buy him time to breathe and think. Most facilities had waiting lists or required deposits he couldn't pay, but finally, he found a place that seemed possible, a small residential care home in a tiny rural town called Willow Creek, nearly 200 miles from Portland, run by a woman named Barbara Feldman who operated what was essentially a boarding house for elderly and disabled adults who had nowhere else to go. Barbara's home was not a licensed memory care facility. It was not equipped for Alzheimer's patients. It was not the kind of place anyone would choose for a loved one if they had any other option. But it was cheap. Barbara was willing to accept Margaret immediately, and she didn't ask too many questions about family involvement or long-term plans. David Chen made arrangements for Margaret's transfer, signed the necessary papers, and then told his family the lie about a specialized Alzheimer's unit. A lie he intended to correct once he figured out how to actually solve the financial crisis he was hiding from everyone. But David Chen never figured it out, never found the money, never came up with a solution. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the temporary lie became a permanent deception. His siblings occasionally asked about Margaret, about how she was doing in the new facility, about when they might visit, and David responded with vague reassurances and invented details. She was stable, the staff were excellent. Visits were complicated because of the facility's isolation and their policies about disrupting patients' routines. Maybe in a few months when things settled down. And because it was easier to believe David than to push for uncomfortable truths. Because everyone was secretly relieved not to have to make that depressing drive and witness their sister's deterioration. Because families are capable of remarkable collective self-deception, when the alternative requires sacrifice and pain, the siblings stopped asking detailed questions. Margaret became a distant concept rather than a real person with immediate needs, and the family settled into a new normal where she existed somewhere out there, being cared for by someone. No longer their daily concern or responsibility. Family gatherings continued, holidays were celebrated, life moved forward, and Margaret Chen's name was mentioned less and less until it almost disappeared entirely from conversation. Meanwhile, in the small town of Willow Creek, Margaret Chen lived out what would be the final years of her life in conditions that bore no resemblance to what her family imagined or what she deserved. Barbara Feldman's residential care home was housed in a converted farmhouse that accommodated 7 residents in various states of physical and cognitive decline. Attended by Barbara and 1 part-time aide who worked afternoon shifts. The house was clean enough to pass occasional county inspections, but it was not equipped for someone with advanced Alzheimer's who required specialized care, constant supervision, and the kind of structured environment that might provide dignity and comfort in the face of a devastating disease. Margaret shared a small room with another woman, had no access to memory care programming or therapies, spent her days largely sitting in a common area watching television that meant nothing to her, and received basic care that kept her physically alive, but offered nothing resembling quality of life. Barbara Feldman was not a cruel person, but she was overwhelmed, underpaid, and running a business that existed in the gaps of the healthcare system, serving people that society and their families had essentially given up on. Margaret Chen had become invisible, forgotten by the people who should have loved her. Warehoused in a place where she was simply one more fragile body requiring minimal maintenance until nature took its course. David Chen visited Margaret exactly twice during her time at Barbara Feldman's home, both visits occurring in the first 3 months after her placement there. Driven by guilt he couldn't quite suppress, and a desperate need to reassure himself that what he had done wasn't completely unconscionable. On those visits, he found Margaret confused but physically stable, and he convinced himself that she wasn't suffering, that she didn't know where she was anyway. That Alzheimer's patients lived in their own reality, regardless of external circumstances. Barbara Feldman, sensing David's discomfort and his desire for reassurance, told him what he wanted to hear. Margaret was doing fine, she ate well, she seemed content, everything was under control. David left cash payments that barely covered a fraction of Margaret's actual costs, promised to send more soon, and then drove back to Portland telling himself he had done what he could. That sometimes there are no perfect solutions, that he was dealing with an impossible situation the best way he knew how. But he never returned for a 3rd visit, never called to check on his sister, never followed up on his promises. The guilt became easier to manage by simply not thinking about Margaret at all, and David became expert at redirecting conversations, changing subjects, and maintaining the fiction that his sister was somewhere safe and properly cared for, even as that fiction drifted further and further from reality. Margaret Chen died on March 22, 2003, in the small bedroom she had shared with a stranger in Barbara Feldman's home in Willow Creek. Her death attributed to complications from Alzheimer's disease and pneumonia. She was 50 years old. Barbara Feldman called the phone number she had on file for David Chen, left a voicemail with the news, and waited for instructions about funeral arrangements or disposal of Margaret's few belongings. When David didn't return her calls after 3 days, Barbara tried again, and then again, leaving increasingly pointed messages about the need to handle the situation. To come collect Margaret's things, to deal with the practicalities of death. Finally, David Chen called back, and in a brief, business-like conversation, he asked Barbara to arrange for the most basic cremation available, promised to send money to cover the costs. Money that never actually arrived, and said he would pick up Margaret's ashes and belongings when he had time, which he never did. Barbara Feldman, frustrated but not particularly surprised, arranged for Margaret's body to be cremated at the county's expense through a program for indigent deceased persons. And she boxed up Margaret's meager belongings: some clothes, a few old photographs, a small jewelry box, and random personal items that represented the physical remainder of a vanished life. David Chen never told his siblings that Margaret had died. This was not an oversight, not a moment of forgetfulness or communication failure, but a deliberate choice born from shame, cowardice, and the recognition that revealing Margaret's death would inevitably lead to questions he could not answer without exposing his years of lies and neglect. How could he explain that their sister had died 4 years ago without anyone knowing, without family present, without a funeral or memorial service, without the basic dignity and ritual that humans provide for their dead? How could he admit that he had hidden Margaret away in an unlicensed facility, that he had failed to pay for her care, that he had essentially abandoned her to die alone among strangers? The truth was impossible to tell without destroying himself, his family's image of him, and the fragile peace that had settled over everyone since Margaret had been conveniently removed from their daily consciousness. So David said nothing, and when his siblings occasionally asked about Margaret in passing, he offered brief, vague updates. She was declining, as expected with Alzheimer's. Communication was difficult. She probably wouldn't recognize anyone anymore. Visits would be too upsetting for everyone involved. And because his siblings had their own lives, their own problems, their own reasons for not wanting to confront Margaret's reality, they accepted David's evasions and moved on. For 13 years after Margaret's death, the Chen family continued their lives with an unspoken understanding that Margaret existed somewhere in permanent institutional care. A tragic figure best not discussed, a source of uncomfortable sadness better left unexplored. Family gatherings happened without her presence being noted. Photographs were taken with one sister missing from every frame. And new generations of Chen children grew up barely aware they had a great-aunt named Margaret who had disappeared into the American healthcare system's darkest corners. David Chen carried his secret alone, and though it weighed on him in private moments of conscience and reflection, he convinced himself that what was done, that revealing the truth now would serve no purpose beyond causing pain, that his siblings were happier not knowing the details of Margaret's decline and death. In 2014, David was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, a diagnosis that came with poor prognosis and rapid progression, and as he faced his own mortality, he made a decision that would ultimately expose everything. He wrote a confession, a detailed letter explaining what had really happened to Margaret where she had spent her final years, when and how she had died, and what he had done to cover it all up. But even in terminal illness, David couldn't bring himself to send that letter, to speak the truth out loud, to face the consequences while he was still alive to witness the destruction. David Chen died in February 2015, and his widow, Patricia Chen, found the sealed letter addressed to his siblings while going through his papers and personal effects in the difficult months after his funeral. Patricia had known fragments of the truth about Margaret, though never the full extent of David's deceptions, and finding the letter forced her into an agonizing decision: honor what she assumed was David's intention to posthumously confess, or destroy the letter and preserve both his memory and the family's peace. Patricia sat with that sealed envelope for 3 weeks, holding the power to detonate a bomb under her late husband's siblings' understanding of their family history, their brother's character, and their own complicity in Margaret's disappearance. In the end, Patricia decided not to deliver the letter, convincing herself that the truth would serve only to cause pain and destroy relationships. That Margaret was dead regardless of what anyone knew or didn't know. That David's memory and his children's image of their father were worth protecting. She placed the letter in a box of David's personal papers, a box that went into storage in the basement of their Portland home, and she told no one about its existence. The truth remained buried, and Margaret Chen's story seemed destined to die with the brother who had hidden it. But secrets have a way of escaping their containers, And the document that would finally shatter the Chen family's long silence emerged from the most unlikely and mundane circumstance imaginable. An estate sale. In 2016, Patricia Chen decided to downsize, selling the large Portland home she had shared with David and moving into a smaller condominium. A transition that required disposing of decades of accumulated possessions, furniture, and stored items that no longer fit into her new, simplified life. She hired an estate sale company to handle the logistics, and over a weekend in September 2016, strangers walked through her former home purchasing everything from furniture to books, to boxes of miscellaneous papers and household items. Among the items sold was a box labeled David's office papers, which Patricia had pulled from basement storage. Glanced through briefly enough to confirm it contained nothing of apparent value or importance, and priced at $10 for someone who might want old file folders and office supplies. The box was purchased by a man named Marcus Wheeler, a retired high school history teacher who frequented estate sales looking for old documents, letters, and papers to use in teaching local history and genealogy research to community education students. Marcus Wheeler brought the box home and spent a rainy Sunday afternoon sorting through its contents, finding mostly what he expected: old tax records, business correspondence, real estate documents, and various papers related to David Chen's professional life. But near the bottom of the box, in a manila envelope that had been carefully sealed and then unsealed, Marcus found something that made him pause and read with growing horror. A 12-page handwritten letter beginning with the words, "To my brothers Thomas and Robert, and my sisters Linda and Susan, there is something I need to tell you about Margaret. Something I should have told you years ago, but didn't have the courage to say while I was alive." Marcus read the entire letter twice, struggling to process the confession unfolding in David Chen's careful handwriting, the story of lies and abandonment, and a woman who had died alone while her family believed she was safely cared for. As a teacher and a human being with basic moral instincts, Marcus understood immediately that this letter was supposed to have been delivered to David Chen's siblings. That its presence in an estate sale box represented another layer of concealment, that somewhere in Portland there were people who needed to know the truth about their sister's fate. The question was whether it was his place to give them that truth, and what consequences might follow from opening this sealed tomb of family secrets. Marcus Wheeler spent 3 days wrestling with the ethical dilemma before deciding he had no choice but to find a way to deliver the letter to its intended recipients. Using the names mentioned in the letter and some basic internet research, he was able to identify Thomas Chen and Linda Chen Morrison, both still living in the Portland area. And he made contact with Linda through a carefully worded Facebook message, explaining that he had come into possession of a letter written by her late brother David that appeared to be important. Family information. Linda's response was cautious and confused. What letter? What information? Why had this stranger contacted her about her dead brother? But she agreed to meet Marcus at a coffee shop to see what he was talking about. When Marcus handed Linda the envelope, and she began reading her brother's confession, her face went through a progression of emotions that Marcus would later describe as the most painful thing he had ever witnessed: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of shattered devastation as the truth about Margaret's disappearance, neglect, and death washed over her. Linda Chen Morrison sat in that coffee shop and learned that her sister had died 13 years earlier, alone and forgotten, while the family had continued their lives believing she was still alive somewhere, still existing in whatever diminished capacity Alzheimer's allowed. Still theoretically a person they might someday visit or reconnect with. What followed was a family reckoning unlike anything the Chens had ever experienced, a series of painful confrontations, revelations, and forced examinations of conscience that would permanently alter every relationship and shatter every comfortable assumption they had maintained for nearly 2 decades. Linda immediately contacted her brothers Thomas and Robert and her sister Susan, insisting on an emergency family meeting where she revealed David's letter and its devastating contents, reading portions aloud as her siblings sat in stunned, silent horror. The initial reaction was disbelief. Surely David had exaggerated or misremembered, Surely Margaret couldn't really have been abandoned that way. Surely they would have known somehow if their sister had died over a decade ago. But as Linda worked through the letter's specific details, dates, and locations, denial became impossible. Thomas Chen, who had always admired David as the successful older brother who had everything figured out, broke down sobbing as the truth penetrated his defenses. Susan Chen, who had been the youngest and always somewhat peripheral to the family's major decisions, began screaming at everyone, demanding to know how they could have let this happen. How they could have been so complacent and incurious about Margaret's fate. And Robert Chen, the quietest of the siblings, simply sat in silence, staring at nothing, processing the realization that his sister had lived her final years in neglect and died without dignity because her family, himself included, had found it easier not to ask difficult questions. The siblings' next step was verification, a desperate hope that maybe David's confession was somehow wrong, exaggerated, a product of illness and guilt rather than accurate history. Linda tracked down Barbara Feldman, who was still operating her care home in Willow Creek, and made the 200-mile drive with Thomas to speak with her directly and learn what had really happened to Margaret. Barbara, now in her 70s and retired from the care business, remembered Margaret clearly and confirmed every detail of David's letter. Margaret had been placed there in late 1998. Had received only the most basic care that Barbara could provide with limited resources. Had been essentially abandoned by her family, with David's rare visits in the first few months, representing the entirety of family contact over nearly 5 years. Barbara still had the box of Margaret's belongings in her garage, stored there for over a decade because David had never come to claim them, and she hadn't known what else to do with the remnants of a forgotten life. She brought out the box, dusty and water-stained, and watched as Linda and Thomas went through their sister's few remaining possessions, worn clothes, a handful of photographs from earlier happier times, a small jewelry box containing a necklace their mother had given Margaret for her high school graduation. Physical evidence of a life that had been discarded and dismissed. But the most shocking revelation came when Linda asked Barbara about Margaret's death and burial, and learned that Margaret had been cremated through the county indigent program because David never sent the promised money for funeral costs, and that her ashes had never been claimed. Never picked up, never given any kind of final resting place or memorial. Barbara explained that after 2 years of holding on to the ashes and trying unsuccessfully to get the family to collect them, she had finally arranged for them to be interred in the county's common burial ground for unclaimed remains. A shared plot in the Willow Creek Cemetery, where multiple people's ashes were buried together without individual markers or identification. Margaret Chen, who had been a professional librarian with a university degree, who had been loved by nieces and nephews, who had been a real person with dignity and worth, had ended up in an unmarked common grave, her death unnoticed by her family, her passing unmourned, her existence erased as completely as if she had never lived at all. Linda and Thomas returned to Portland with Margaret's box of belongings and the unbearable weight of knowing that their collective failure as a family had resulted in the most fundamental form of abandonment, allowing their sister to die alone and disappear into the earth without recognition, ritual, or remembrance. The Chen siblings were forced to confront not just David's lies and failures, but their own complicity in Margaret's disappearance. Their own willingness to accept convenient fictions rather than demand uncomfortable truths. In painful family discussions that stretched over weeks, they began to acknowledge the ways each of them had participated in erasing Margaret from family consciousness. Accepting vague answers when they should have demanded specifics, never insisting on visiting despite years passing. Never following up on their own responsibility to contribute financially to their sister's care. Never questioning the increasingly implausible story that Margaret was fine, somewhere they couldn't quite visit. David had been the primary architect of the deception, but they had all been willing accomplices, and that shared guilt was perhaps more difficult to bear than David's singular betrayal. Linda, tormented by memories of her once close relationship with Margaret and her failure to protect her sister, began researching Alzheimer's care and elder abuse. Learning about the systemic failures and family dynamics that allow vulnerable people to fall through society's cracks. She discovered that Margaret's story, while shocking in its specifics, was not unique. Thousands of elderly and disabled Americans disappear into inadequate care situations every year. Forgotten by overwhelmed families, and failed by an underfunded, fragmented long-term care system that warehouses people rather than providing dignified support. The family made the decision to hold a memorial service for Margaret, an event that took place in Portland in December 2016. 18 years after she had vanished from their lives, and 13 years after her death. They rented a small chapel, created a memorial display with photographs of Margaret from throughout her life, and invited extended family members, many of whom had no idea Margaret had died or had even been missing in any meaningful sense. During the service, Linda gave a eulogy that was brutally honest about what had happened, about the family's failures, about the need to acknowledge Margaret not just as a victim of disease, but as a person who had been failed by the people who should have protected her. She spoke about the silence that had allowed Margaret to vanish, the collective willingness to look away from difficulty and discomfort, and the human cost of choosing convenience over compassion. Thomas read from Margaret's old journals, passages Barbara had found among her belongings that showed who Margaret had been before Alzheimer's stole her mind. Funny, thoughtful, observant. A person with dreams and opinions, and a full inner life that deserved to be remembered. The service was attended by fewer than 30 people, a small gathering for a life that should have been celebrated by many more. And it ended with the family placing Margaret's name on a memorial plaque at the Portland Cemetery, giving her at least a symbolic marker, even though her ashes remained in the common grave in Willow Creek. In the months following the memorial service, Linda Chen Morrison became determined to understand not just what had happened to Margaret, but how such a failure had been possible. What systemic problems and family dynamics had enabled one human being to so completely vanish, while her family carried on with their lives. She began speaking with elder care advocates, social workers, and attorneys who specialized in elder abuse and neglect cases, learning about the gaps in the American long-term care system that create situations like Margaret's. She discovered that there is virtually no oversight of patients once they're placed in care facilities, no requirement that family members maintain contact or provide information about whereabouts, no system to track vulnerable adults and ensure they haven't been abandoned or disappeared. If a family wants to hide an inconvenient relative, to place them somewhere remote and forget about them, there are few legal or practical barriers preventing it. Margaret's case was made more tragic by her early-onset Alzheimer's, which struck when she was too young to have established the kind of retirement resources and social safety net that might have protected her, and which progressed so quickly that she lost the ability to advocate for herself or question her circumstances before anyone realized how dire the situation would become. Linda also began the difficult work of tracing Margaret's final years, trying to piece together what her sister's life had been like in the place where the family had abandoned her. Talking to people who had known or cared for Margaret during her time at Barbara Feldman's home, she found the part-time aide who had worked there during Margaret's residence, a woman named Carol Henderson who remembered Margaret as quiet and withdrawn, often sitting alone, sometimes agitated in ways that suggested confusion and fear, but that no one had the training or resources to properly address. Carol described moments when Margaret seemed to be searching for something or someone, looking toward the door as if expecting visitors who never came, and periods where she would become upset and repeatedly ask for David or Linda, names that meant nothing to the staff, but that were clearly important to Margaret in whatever fragmented memories remained. Hearing these accounts was devastating for Linda, imagining her sister spending years in a confused, frightened state, waiting for family that never arrived, unable to understand why she had been left in a strange place with strangers. The guilt was overwhelming, but Linda forced herself to learn every detail, believing that bearing witness to Margaret's suffering was the least she owed her sister, the minimum act of acknowledgement that should have happened years earlier. The Chen family's relationships would never fully recover from the revelations about Margaret. While Linda and Thomas tried to maintain some connection, Family gatherings became strained and uncomfortable, loaded with unspoken recriminations and the weight of shared guilt. Susan Chen largely withdrew from family contact, unable to reconcile her self-image with her role in Margaret's abandonment. Struggling with depression, and what her therapist described as complicated grief for a sister whose death she couldn't properly mourn because it had happened so long ago without her knowledge. Robert Chen became quietly obsessed with the question of whether Margaret had suffered, spending hours researching Alzheimer's progression and trying to convince himself that his sister's disease had advanced far enough that she hadn't really been aware of her abandonment, that she had lived in her own internal reality rather than experiencing the external neglect. But the research provided no real comfort. Studies suggested that Alzheimer's patients often retain emotional awareness even when cognitive function is severely impaired, that they feel loneliness and abandonment even if they can't articulate why, that Margaret had likely spent years in emotional pain that her family could have alleviated simply by showing up and reminding her she was loved and not forgotten. Patricia Chen, David's widow, was confronted by her late husband's siblings with fury and demands for explanation. Had she known about Margaret while David was alive? Why had she kept the confession letter secret? How could she have participated in allowing the family to believe a lie for over a year after David's death? Patricia's defense, that she had been trying to protect David's memory and spare everyone pain, rang hollow to siblings who had been denied the chance to mourn their sister properly, to give her a timely funeral, to at least acknowledge her death when it actually occurred. The confrontation destroyed whatever relationship had existed between Patricia and her late husband's siblings, and it also damaged her relationship with her own adult children, who were horrified to learn that their father had been responsible for such cruelty and that their mother had chosen to hide the truth. David and Patricia's eldest son, Kevin Chen, wrote a letter to his aunts and uncles apologizing for his father's actions and his mother's concealment, expressing shame at carrying the family name, and attempting to grapple with the realization that the father he had admired had been capable of abandoning his own sister. The letter was compassionate and thoughtful, but it couldn't undo the harm or restore what had been lost, and it served mainly as evidence that the damage extended beyond one generation. That Margaret's disappearance had created ripples of pain and dysfunction that would affect the family for years to come. Linda Chen Morrison, channeling her grief and guilt into action, began working with a local advocacy organization focused on elder care reform and protection of vulnerable adults. She shared Margaret's story publicly, writing articles and speaking at community events about the systemic failures and family dynamics that had enabled her sister's disappearance and death. Her advocacy focused on three main areas: better oversight of long-term care facilities, including unlicensed residential care homes like Barbara Feldman's, mandatory wellness checks and location, tracking for adults with cognitive impairments like Alzheimer's, and education for families about the dangers of designating a single family member to handle care arrangements without transparency or accountability. Linda was brutally honest about her own failures and those of her siblings, refusing to portray themselves as innocent victims, and instead acknowledging their complicity in choosing comfort over responsibility. Her willingness to speak openly about the family's shame and failure made Margaret's story particularly powerful. This wasn't just a case of institutional neglect. It was a case of ordinary people making terrible choices that seemed rational or necessary at the time, but that resulted in unspeakable harm to someone they supposedly loved. In 2017, Linda worked with an attorney to explore whether any legal action could be taken related to Margaret's case, whether David's estate could be held accountable for abandonment, or whether Barbara Feldman or Riverside Care Center bore any responsibility for accepting a patient and then failing to ensure proper oversight of her care. The legal analysis was discouraging. David was dead and couldn't face criminal charges for abandonment or fraud. His estate had been distributed, and attempting to claw back assets would be nearly impossible. Barbara Feldman had provided the basic care she was equipped to offer and wasn't licensed as a memory care facility, so couldn't be held to those standards. And Riverside Care Center had properly discharged Margaret when payment stopped, and wasn't responsible for David's lies about where she went next. The statute of limitations had expired for most potential civil claims, and proving damages was complicated by the fact that Margaret had been incapacitated and deceased for over a decade. In essence, the legal system offered no meaningful recourse, no accountability, no justice for what had been done to Margaret Chen. The attorney explained that Margaret's case exposed a fundamental problem with elder care law. The system assumes family members act in good faith and provide oversight, and when they don't, there are few mechanisms to detect or prevent neglect until it's far too late to help the victim. Margaret had fallen through every safety net, and the law had nothing to offer her survivors except the cold comfort that what happened, while morally reprehensible, wasn't technically prosecutable. The emotional toll on Linda was severe, and by late 2017, she was in therapy trying to process the complicated grief of losing her sister twice. Once to Alzheimer's disease and once to family abandonment, and grappling with the knowledge that she had been present and capable, but had failed to act when action might have made a difference. Her therapist helped her understand that she was experiencing a particular form of grief called ambiguous loss, where the person died long ago, but the survivor only recently learned about the death, creating a strange temporal displacement where the mourning is fresh, but the loss is ancient, where there's no opportunity to say goodbye because the goodbye should have happened years earlier. Linda also struggled with intrusive thoughts and questions that had no answers. Had Margaret asked for her in those final years? Had she felt betrayed when her family never came? Had she died frightened and alone? Had there been a moment of clarity where she understood she'd been abandoned? These questions tormented Linda because they were simultaneously crucial and irrelevant. Crucial because they spoke to Margaret's experience and suffering. Irrelevant because the answers couldn't change what had happened or restore what had been lost. The only thing that helped was the advocacy work, turning private grief into public purpose, trying to ensure that Margaret's story would prevent similar failures for other vulnerable people. In March 2018, exactly 15 years after Margaret's death, Linda organized a small private ceremony at the Willow Creek Cemetery where Margaret's ashes had been interred in the common burial ground. The cemetery manager helped Linda identify the approximate location of the common plot, though he couldn't specify exactly where Margaret's remains were within the shared space. Linda and Thomas placed flowers on the ground, planted a small rose bush nearby with a small marker that read, "In memory of Margaret Chen, 1952-2003, beloved sister." Not forgotten, and spent an afternoon sitting by the grave talking about Margaret, sharing memories from before the illness, trying to honor who their sister had been before Alzheimer's stole her mind, and family failures stole her dignity. They talked about Margaret's laugh, her habit of bringing books as gifts because she believed reading was the greatest pleasure in life, her subtle dry humor that could surprise you, her fierce independence that had sometimes worried their traditional parents, but that they now saw as strength and courage. It was the kind of conversation they should have had years earlier, the kind of memorial that should have happened when Margaret actually died, but late recognition was better than eternal silence. As they sat in that rural cemetery, they acknowledged the terrible truth that Margaret's physical location didn't really matter. She had been erased from family memory long before she died. And this small ceremony couldn't undo that erasure, only acknowledge it and mourn what had been lost. The broader Chen family continued to fragment in the years following Margaret's story coming to light, with younger generation members taking sides, asking difficult questions about family values and character, and struggling with the legacy of a shameful secret. David and Patricia's 3 adult children dealt with the revelation in different ways. The eldest son, Kevin, tried to understand his father's actions in context while not excusing them. The middle daughter, Rachel, cut off contact with her mother entirely for concealing the confession letter. And the youngest son, Matthew, struggled with anger and embarrassment that affected his own mental health and relationships. The cousins who had known Aunt Margaret vaguely in childhood had to reckon with the fact that they had lived their entire adult lives while she was dying alone and forgotten, and that their parents had participated in that forgetting. Family text chains and social media connections that had previously shared happy updates and photos became battlegrounds for recrimination and defense, with some family members arguing that everyone needed to move on, and others insisting that the harm couldn't be healed without full accountability. The Chen family had fractured along lines of guilt, denial, and competing narratives about responsibility, and while some relationships eventually stabilized into a new uncomfortable normal, others were permanently destroyed by the weight of what had been revealed. In 2019, Linda Chen Morrison testified before the Oregon State Legislature in support of a proposed bill that would create additional oversight requirements for residential care facilities and establish a vulnerable adult registry to track individuals with cognitive impairments and ensure regular wellness checks by social services. During her testimony, Linda told Margaret's story in detail, explaining how her sister had disappeared from family awareness and then from life itself without any system or safeguard catching the abandonment. She spoke about the gaps in regulation that allowed unlicensed facilities like Barbara Feldman's home to house vulnerable people without adequate oversight, the lack of requirements for family contact or care plan reviews, and the ease with which someone with Alzheimer's could simply vanish because no agency or organization was responsible for tracking their well-being. Linda's testimony was emotional and powerful, and it received significant media attention, with local news outlets running stories about Margaret Chen's case under headlines like "The Woman Who Disappeared Twice" and "Family Silence Hides Alzheimer's Patient's Death for 13 Years." Publicity was painful for the family, airing their shame publicly and making Margaret's tragedy a matter of public discussion and judgment. But Linda believed the discomfort was necessary if it would prevent other families from making similar choices and other vulnerable people from suffering similar fates. The proposed legislation, which became known informally as Margaret's Law, faced significant opposition from care facility operators who argued that additional regulations would be burdensome and expensive, and from conservative legislators who opposed expanding government oversight into family matters and private business operations. Opponents argued that Margaret's case, while tragic, was an outlier that didn't justify broad new regulations that would affect thousands of facilities and families, and that better solutions would come from family education rather than government mandates. Supporters countered that Margaret's case was only unusual in that it had been discovered and publicized. Countless other vulnerable adults were likely in similar situations without anyone knowing or investigating, and the state had a responsibility to protect its most vulnerable citizens when families failed in that duty. The legislative debate became heated and political, with testimony from families who had lost loved ones to neglect, care facility operators defending their practices, and policy experts arguing about the balance between oversight and autonomy. Ultimately, a watered-down version of the bill passed in 2020, creating some additional reporting requirements for residential care homes and establishing a voluntary registry for tracking Alzheimer's patients, but failing to mandate the kind of robust oversight that advocates had sought. Linda was disappointed but not surprised, understanding that systemic change happens slowly and imperfectly, and that Margaret's story had at least moved the conversation forward, even if it hadn't achieved comprehensive reform. As Linda continued her advocacy work, she connected with other families who had experienced similar situations. Adult children who had placed elderly parents in care facilities and then lost track of them. Siblings who discovered years later that a brother or sister with dementia had died without anyone notifying them. Family members who had designated one person to handle care arrangements, only to discover that person had lied about or mismanaged the situation. These stories shared common patterns: financial pressure that made proper care seem impossible, family conflict about responsibility and resources, one family member taking control of the situation and then concealing problems from others, gradual reduction in contact that became total estrangement, and eventually the discovery of neglect or death long after it occurred. Linda learned that the dynamics that had destroyed Margaret's life and fractured the Chen family were not unique aberrations, but rather predictable outcomes of a system that places enormous responsibility on families without providing adequate support, oversight or resources. The American approach to elder care and long-term disability support is fundamentally broken. Linda came to understand, relying on family members who are often overwhelmed, underprepared, and themselves struggling financially and emotionally, and offering almost no safety net when those family systems fail. By 2021, Linda had collected over 200 similar stories from families across the country who had experienced some form of elder abandonment, neglect, or institutional disappearance of relatives with Alzheimer's, dementia, or other cognitive impairments. She created a website and blog called Remember the Forgotten, where families could share their stories and find resources for navigating the complex, inadequate system of long-term care in America. The website also provided practical guidance for families facing decisions about care for relatives with dementia, how to ensure transparency and shared responsibility among family members, warning signs of facility neglect or financial exploitation, legal tools like care agreements and mandatory reporting requirements, and emotional support for dealing with the guilt and grief that often accompanied these situations. Linda's work gave meaning to Margaret's suffering and death, transforming private tragedy into public education and advocacy, ensuring that her sister's name and story would be remembered and might prevent others from experiencing similar abandonment. The website received thousands of visitors, and Linda began receiving emails and messages from people thanking her for speaking openly about failure, guilt, and family dysfunction in ways that made them feel less alone in their own difficult experiences. Linda also worked to preserve Margaret's memory beyond the advocacy context, creating a more personal memorial that honored who her sister had been as a complete human being rather than just as a victim of disease and neglect. She collected Margaret's old journals, photographs, and the few belongings that had been recovered from Barbara Feldman's storage. And she created a digital memorial archive that told Margaret's life story from childhood through her career as a librarian, her relationships with family, and her personality and interests before Alzheimer's began its destructive work. Linda interviewed people who had known Margaret in different contexts, former colleagues from the library, friends from her San Francisco days, the nieces and nephews who remembered her visits and gifts, and she compiled their memories into a portrait of Margaret as a real, complex person who had been funny and smart and kind, and sometimes difficult and always fully human. The archive included photos of Margaret at different ages, excerpts from her journals showing her voice and thoughts, and remembrances from people whose lives she had touched. Linda's goal was to ensure that Margaret wouldn't be reduced to the circumstances of her disappearance and death, that she would be remembered for the 50 years of life she had lived, not just the tragic ending that had consumed her final years. In late 2022, Linda received an unexpected message from Barbara Feldman, the woman who had operated the care home where Margaret spent her final years. Barbara, now in her late 70s and in declining health herself, reached out to say she had been following Linda's advocacy work online and wanted to apologize for her role in Margaret's story. Barbara explained that she had been running a care home out of financial necessity, trying to help people who had nowhere else to go but operating with minimal resources and no proper training for dementia care, and that she had known Margaret deserved better than what she was able to provide. She described the guilt she had carried for years, wondering if she should have refused to take Margaret in the first place, if she should have reported David to authorities for abandonment, if there was something more she could have done despite her limitations. Linda listened to Barbara's confession and apology, and while she couldn't fully absolve Barbara of responsibility, she also recognized that Barbara had been caught in the same broken system that had failed Margaret. A system where the most vulnerable people end up in inadequate care situations because there are no adequate options available or affordable. Where people like Barbara operate unlicensed facilities not out of cruelty, but out of economic necessity, and a desire to help despite being unequipped to do so. The conversation was difficult and emotional for both women, but it ended with Linda thanking Barbara for taking the time to reach out and acknowledging that assigning individual blame was less important than understanding and changing the systemic failures that create these tragedies. As of 2024, Linda Chen Morrison continues her advocacy work while also trying to rebuild some version of family connection with her surviving siblings and the younger generation of Chens. The relationship with Thomas has strengthened through their shared work on preserving Margaret's memory and supporting elder care reform. While relationships with Robert and Susan remain strained but civil, functioning at the level of occasional contact and surface-level pleasantries rather than genuine intimacy. The younger generation has been more willing to engage with Margaret's story and its implications, with several of David's and Linda's adult children becoming involved in elder care advocacy and using their professional skills in law, social work, and healthcare to address the systemic problems their family's tragedy exposed. Linda sometimes reflects on the strange trajectory of Margaret's impact, how her life was diminished and erased in her final years, but how her story after death has touched thousands of people and contributed to meaningful conversations about care, family responsibility, and social support for vulnerable populations. It's not the legacy Margaret would have chosen, and it doesn't redeem the failures that led to her suffering and lonely death, but it's something, a way of ensuring that she matters, that her life and death weren't entirely meaningless, that some good emerged from the terrible waste of a human being's dignity and worth. The Chen family story raises uncomfortable questions about family obligation, systemic failure, and the human capacity for self-deception when confronting difficult truths would require sacrifice and discomfort. How does a family collectively agree to forget someone, to stop asking questions, to accept vague assurances rather than demanding accountability? How does a sibling abandon a sister and then live with that choice for years, maintaining the fiction that everything is handled and fine? How do multiple intelligent, functional adults participate in erasing someone from their consciousness and then act surprised when the truth emerges years later? The answers are not simple, and Linda has spent years thinking about the psychology and circumstances that enabled her family's failure. She's come to understand that it wasn't a single terrible decision, but rather a series of small choices that seemed reasonable or necessary at the time. Accepting David's offer to handle everything because it was easier than arguing about responsibility. Skipping a visit because the drive was long and the experience depressing. Not pushing for details because you didn't really want to know the details. Telling yourself that your sibling with Alzheimer's wouldn't remember you anyway, so what difference did your presence make? Each small choice compounded the previous ones, until the distance between the family and Margaret became so vast that bridging it would have required admitting to years of neglect. And it became easier to maintain the fiction than face the reality. Linda also recognizes that Margaret's story is fundamentally about American healthcare system failures, about a society that hasn't figured out how to care for its elderly and disabled citizens with dignity and adequacy. That places overwhelming burdens on families and then offers almost no support when those families struggle or fail. In most wealthy developed nations, long-term care for conditions like Alzheimer's is primarily a public responsibility, with government-funded programs ensuring adequate care facilities, professional support, and oversight to prevent neglect and abuse. In the United States, long-term care is primarily a private family responsibility, with costs that can exceed $100,000 per year, limited insurance coverage, and a fragmented system of facilities ranging from excellent to horrifically neglectful with inadequate oversight to ensure quality. Margaret fell through the cracks of this system, but the cracks are wide and deep, and thousands of people fall through them every year, disappearing into substandard facilities, suffering neglect and abuse, dying without dignity because their families either can't afford proper care or can't manage the overwhelming logistics and emotional toll of providing it. Linda's advocacy has taught her that while her family bears responsibility for specific failures related to Margaret, the larger responsibility lies with a society that has chosen not to prioritize or adequately fund care for its most vulnerable members. The practical lessons from Margaret Chen's story are straightforward but difficult. Families dealing with Alzheimer's or dementia cases need to maintain transparency and shared responsibility among all members. No single person should have unquestioned control over care decisions and information. Regular in-person visits need to be mandatory regardless of difficulty or distance. Financial arrangements need to be documented and reviewed by multiple family members. And outside oversight through social workers or patient advocates should be established to catch problems before they become catastrophic. These are simple, obvious safeguards, but implementing them requires family members to prioritize the vulnerable person's needs over their own comfort, to maintain difficult commitments over years, to trust each other and also verify that trust is warranted, and to face painful realities rather than accepting comfortable fictions. It requires treating the person with dementia as a full human being who matters, who deserves dignity, who is still your mother or brother or aunt, even when they can't remember your name. It requires recognizing that Alzheimer's doesn't just rob the patient of their memories and self. It tests whether the family will remember and value them when they can no longer advocate for themselves, whether love and obligation mean anything when they're inconvenient and costly. Linda Chen Morrison is now in her late 60s, and she sometimes thinks about her own future, about what will happen if she develops Alzheimer's or another condition that renders her vulnerable and dependent on others for care. She has been intentional about creating legal and financial structures to protect herself. Advanced directives, long-term care insurance, designated advocates with clear oversight responsibilities, and honest conversations with her adult children about her wishes and expectations. She has also made her children promise that if she becomes incapacitated, they will visit her regularly no matter what condition she's in. That they will not designate a single sibling to handle everything. That they will not allow her to disappear from their lives the way Margaret disappeared from hers. These conversations are difficult and emotional, requiring her children to imagine her decline and death, but Linda believes they're necessary. That Margaret's story taught her that the time to establish safeguards is before the crisis, not during it when emotions and financial pressures and exhaustion can lead to terrible decisions that seem reasonable in the moment, but that have irreversible consequences. Linda's greatest fear is not death itself, but rather the possibility of dying forgotten, erased, unmourned, and she has worked to ensure that won't be her fate even if it was her sister's. For the Chen family, Margaret's absence is now more present than it was during the years when she was supposedly alive and cared for somewhere distant and undefined. Her story is told to younger generations as a cautionary tale, a family history that can't be hidden or sanitized, but must be acknowledged with all its shame and failure intact. Her name comes up in conversations about responsibility, about truth-telling, about what families owe to each other, and what happens when those obligations are abandoned. The small memorial marker in the Portland cemetery where her name is recorded has become a place where family members sometimes visit, not because Margaret's physical remains are there. They're in the common plot in Willow Creek, but because it's a tangible location to direct grief and remembrance. A place to say the things they should have said years earlier, when it might have mattered to Margaret herself. Some family members have made the longer journey to Willow Creek to visit the actual grave site, to stand in the rural cemetery where Margaret's ashes were buried without ceremony or recognition, to physically witness the isolation and anonymity that characterized her final resting place. These visits don't change what happened, but they serve as acts of witness, acknowledgments that Margaret's fate was wrong, that she deserved better, that her family failed her in ways they can name but never fully repair. The discovery of David Chen's confession letter was, in many ways, the moment when Margaret Chen finally came home, not physically but in terms of family consciousness and memory. She stopped being the vague, disappeared sister no one quite talked about and became instead a real person whose suffering and abandonment demanded recognition and response. The truth destroyed the family's comfortable silence, and while that destruction was painful, it was also necessary, the only possible path toward any kind of meaningful reckoning or redemption. Truth, even when it comes too late to help its subject, still matters, still has power, still demands something from those who encounter it. Marcus Wheeler, the retired teacher who found the letter at an estate sale and made the difficult decision to deliver it to Margaret's family, sometimes thinks about whether he did the right thing. Whether bringing that information to light caused more harm than good. Whether Linda and her siblings would have been happier remaining ignorant of when and how Margaret died. But he ultimately believes that truth has inherent value, that families deserve to know what happened to their loved ones, that secrets, even compassionate ones meant to spare pain, usually cause more damage than disclosure. His decision to find Linda and give her the letter broke open the Chen family's carefully maintained fiction, but it also gave them the opportunity to honor Margaret, to acknowledge failure, to learn and possibly change, chances they wouldn't have had if the letter remained hidden forever in a box in someone's basement. There is no happy ending to Margaret Chen's story, no redemptive twist that makes her suffering meaningful or her family's failures forgivable. She lived her final years in neglect and confusion. She died alone without family present. She was buried without ceremony in an unmarked common grave. And she was forgotten by the people who should have loved her most fiercely when she was most vulnerable. The truth about her fate destroyed family relationships and exposed shameful failures that can never be undone or fully atoned for. But within that bleak reality, there are small, fragile threads of meaning. Linda's determination to ensure Margaret is remembered not just as a victim, but as a complete person who lived a full life before illness struck. The advocacy work that has helped other families avoid similar failures, the conversations and policy changes that Margaret's story has inspired. The younger generation's commitment to learning from their family's mistakes and doing better. These threads don't redeem the core tragedy, but they represent the human capacity to extract meaning from failure, to transform shame into purpose, to ensure that even a life that ended in abandonment and erasure still ultimately matters to the world. Margaret Chen deserved better than she received, but her story, now known and shared, has become a testament to what happens when families and systems fail their most vulnerable members, and what it might take to prevent such failures in the future. The silence that surrounded Margaret Chen's disappearance and death for nearly 2 decades was not a simple absence of sound or information, but rather an active, collaborative effort by multiple people to avoid uncomfortable truths and difficult responsibilities. It was a silence built on fear of conflict, financial anxiety, emotional exhaustion, and the very human tendency to believe what's comfortable rather than investigate what's true. That silence was finally broken not by moral courage or family integrity, but by accident. By the random chance of a letter ending up in an estate sale box and being purchased by someone who believed truth mattered more than maintaining comfortable fictions. And when that silence broke, the sound that emerged was not peaceful resolution, but rather the painful noise of long-suppressed grief, guilt, and rage. The sound of a family reckoning with its capacity for cruelty and self-deception. Linda Chen Morrison has spent years since that breaking trying to transform the noise into something more like a song. A way of making Margaret's suffering and death mean something beyond individual tragedy. A contribution to larger conversations about care, responsibility, and human dignity. It's imperfect and incomplete work, but it's the only work available to those who survived the people they failed, the only way to live with guilt that can't be absolved. For anyone listening to this story, the question it poses is direct and uncomfortable. What are you choosing not to see? What uncomfortable questions are you not asking? What convenient explanations are you accepting without verification? Because investigating would be difficult or disruptive. The Chen family were not monsters or outliers. They were ordinary people facing challenging circumstances, making decisions that seemed reasonable given their constraints and pressures, telling themselves stories that allowed them to live with their choices. But those reasonable decisions and comforting stories resulted in a human being spending her final years in isolation and dying forgotten. And that outcome was enabled by collective willingness to prioritize comfort over truth, convenience over connection, emotional self-protection over moral obligation. Margaret Chen's story is a mirror held up to the ways families and societies handle vulnerable populations. The ways we warehouse and forget people when caring for them becomes too difficult or expensive. The ways we construct elaborate justifications for abandonment and call it necessity. The question is not whether you are capable of such failures. All humans are capable of them given sufficient pressure and rationalization, but rather what safeguards, commitments, and values you establish now, before crisis, to reduce the likelihood that capability becomes reality. Margaret Chen was born in 1952, lived 50 years, worked as a librarian, loved her nieces and nephews, had friends and interests and a full internal life, and then developed a terrible disease that stole her mind and eventually her life. But it was not Alzheimer's alone that killed Margaret's dignity and erased her from the world. It was human choices, family failures, systemic inadequacies, and the collective decision to look away from what was difficult to witness. Her story survived through an accident of documentation, a letter that should have been destroyed or delivered, but was instead filed away and forgotten until chance brought it into daylight. The question Linda Chen Morrison asks in her advocacy work is simple. How many other Margarets are out there right now? How many vulnerable people have disappeared from family consciousness and are living in inadequate conditions or have died without anyone noticing? How many stories will never be discovered because there was no confession letter, no Marcus Wheeler making the difficult choice to deliver uncomfortable truth? The answer is unknowable, but certainly not zero, possibly not even small. Somewhere tonight, someone is sitting in a care facility wondering why their family doesn't visit anymore. Someone is dying alone and unmourned. Someone is being erased from the world, while people who supposedly love them carry on with their comfortable lives. Margaret Chen's story can't save those people, but it can remind those of us listening that vulnerability demands protection, that memory requires witness. That dignity is not inherent, but rather something we grant to each other through attention, presence, and care. And it can remind us that silence, even when it feels like peace, is often just another name for abandonment. If Margaret Chen's story has moved you, made you angry, or forced you to think differently about family obligation and vulnerable populations, then perhaps her suffering and death have achieved some small meaning beyond personal tragedy. Honor her memory by checking on your own elderly or disabled relatives, by asking difficult questions instead of accepting easy answers, by being present even when presence is uncomfortable, by remembering that every person in a care facility is someone's sister or father or friend who deserves dignity until their final breath. And if you have stories similar to Margaret's, if you've witnessed or experienced the abandonment of vulnerable adults by overwhelmed families or failed systems, share those stories. Speak those names. Refuse to let silence protect the comfortable at the expense of the forgotten. Margaret Chen was erased once by her family's failures. Don't let her be erased again by collective forgetting. Next time on Vanished and Found, we investigate the case of a young man who disappeared from a college campus in the middle of the semester, leaving behind a dorm room that told two completely different stories, depending on which half you examined, and a coded message in a textbook that his professors insisted couldn't possibly mean what his family believed it meant. The truth would take 17 years, and a deathbed confession from someone who wasn't even supposed to be in the state that night to finally emerge. Subscribe and follow to hear that story and others like it, mysteries that hide in plain sight, truths that wait years to surface, and families that learn the hardest way that silence is never neutral. This is Vanished and Found. Some disappearances take seconds, the hiding takes decades, and the truth, when it comes, changes everything.